The photograph captured the moment perfectly. Thomas Whitmore, proud hotel owner, pointing upward at his whites only sign while Billie Holiday stood calmly before him, her face showing neither anger nor fear. What the photograph couldn't capture was what happened next. The words Holiday spoke that hit Whitmore like a lightning bolt, the tears that streamed down his face, and the unprecedented sight of a Southern hotel owner destroying his own segregation signs while his white customers watched in stunned silence. This moment would change civil rights history forever. If stories of transformation through compassion and the power of human dignity resonate with you, consider subscribing to witness more moments when courage changed hearts and history. Birmingham, Alabama. Spring of 1949. The Whitmore Hotel stood at the corner of 5th Avenue and 19th Street, a modest establishment that catered to traveling salesmen and families passing through the South. Thomas Whitmore had inherited the business from his father, along with certain beliefs about how the world should be ordered, beliefs that were reflected in the freshly painted sign that hung above his entrance. The letters were bold and clear, painted just that morning after he'd heard through the grapevine that a famous Negro jazz singer would be performing in town that evening and might need accommodations. Thomas had been 28 years old when he took over the hotel in 1945, and he ran it exactly as his father had taught him, with firm rules about who could stay and who couldn't. He wasn't a man who thought much about these rules or questioned them. They were simply the way things had always been, the natural order passed down through generations, as unchangeable as the Alabama clay beneath his feet. His regular customers appreciated his adherence to tradition, and he took pride in maintaining what he called standards that his father would have approved of. When Billie Holiday's tour bus pulled up to the Whitmore Hotel that afternoon, Thomas had been expecting it. Word traveled fast in Birmingham, and he'd been told that Lady Day's manager had called ahead requesting rooms for the singer and her band. Thomas had spent the morning preparing for this moment, not by readying rooms, but by making sure his position was absolutely clear. He stood in the doorway as Holiday approached, her elegant figure moving with a grace that seemed to contradict the dusty street and harsh afternoon sun. Behind her, members of her band waited by the bus, instruments cases in hand, exhaustion visible on their faces after 12 hours of driving through the night. Thomas's hand went up immediately, his finger pointing toward the sign above his head before Holiday could even speak. His stance was defensive, shoulders squared, jaw set in determination. He'd turned away other Negro performers before, traveling musicians who thought their fame might grant them exception to the rules, and he expected this encounter to follow the same pattern. A brief confrontation, maybe some angry words, then departure. What he didn't expect was for Holiday to stop exactly where she stood, about 10 feet from his doorway, and simply look at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not anger, not pleading, something else entirely that made him deeply uncomfortable in a way he couldn't name. Holiday's voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet enough that Thomas had to lean forward slightly to hear her clearly. She didn't address the sign. She didn't argue about her right to accommodations or invoke her fame or the money she could pay. Instead, she asked him a question that would echo in his mind for the rest of his life. "Whitmore, do you know what it feels like to be so tired that your bones ache, to have traveled all night with nowhere to rest, and to see someone look at you like you're less than human?" The question hung in the air between them, simple and direct, absent of accusation, yet somehow more powerful than any argument could have been. But it was what Holiday did next that truly shattered something inside Thomas Whitmore. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small photograph, weathered and creased from being carried for years. She held it up so he could see, a picture of a young woman in a nurse's uniform, standing proudly in front of a hospital. "This is my mother," Holiday said softly. "She worked as a maid in Baltimore, cleaning houses for families who wouldn't let her use their front door. But she also volunteered at a hospital, helping anyone who needed care. White, black, didn't matter to her. She believed people were people, and that kindness was the only thing that really mattered in this world." Holiday paused, letting him study the photograph, then continued. "She died when I was young, but she taught me that the way we treat others when we have power over them is the measure of who we really are." Thomas found himself staring at that photograph, at the proud smile on the face of a woman who looked remarkably like the famous singer standing before him, and something unprecedented happened. He thought about his own mother, who had passed away just 2 years earlier, and how she used to sneak food to hungry travelers regardless of their color, always when his father wasn't looking. He thought about the countless times he'd pointed at that sign, feeling righteous in his enforcement of rules he'd never questioned. And he thought about what his mother might think if she could see him now, treating another mother's daughter, a woman whose voice had brought joy to millions, as unworthy of basic human dignity. What happened next would become the subject of newspaper articles, sermons, and civil rights discussions for years to come, though the full story would take decades to emerge completely. Thomas Whitmore stepped back from his doorway, looked up at the sign he'd been so proud to paint that morning, and felt something break inside him, not in pain, but in liberation. Without a word, he walked into his office, retrieved a ladder from the storage room, and carried it out to the front of his hotel while Billie Holiday and her band watched in confusion. His regular customers, who had been observing the confrontation from the hotel restaurant windows, came outside to see what their familiar hotel owner was doing. Thomas climbed that ladder with hands that shook from something other than physical exertion. When he reached the sign, he paused for just a moment, as if saying goodbye to a version of himself he'd carried his entire life. Then he began to pull it down, the nails screeching as they came free from the wood, the sound seeming unnaturally loud in the silence that had fallen over Fifth Avenue. When he descended with the sign in his hands, tears were streaming down his face in a way that shocked everyone present, including himself. He carried the sign to a trash barrel near the street corner and dropped it inside, then turned back to Holiday, who stood exactly where he'd left her, her expression now showing something that might have been hope mixed with disbelief. "Miss Holiday," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion he'd never shown publicly before, "I have 8 rooms available, and I'd be honored if you and your band would accept my hospitality. No charge." But he didn't stop there. As his customers and a growing crowd of passers-by watched in amazement, Thomas walked back into his hotel and began removing every sign that indicated separation or preference, from the restaurant entrance, from the lobby bathrooms, from the water fountain in the corridor. Each one joined the first in the trash barrel, and with each removal Thomas felt lighter, as if he'd been carrying a weight he hadn't known was crushing him. By evening, word had spread throughout Birmingham about what had happened at the Whitmore Hotel. Some of Thomas's regular customers canceled their reservations in protest, calling him a traitor to Southern tradition and threatening to spread word that he'd lost his mind. But others, particularly younger folks, and a surprising number of older residents who'd been quietly uncomfortable with segregation but afraid to speak up, came by to shake his hand and tell him he'd done the right thing. Local Negro community leaders, who had been organizing quiet resistance to segregation for years, arrived to verify that the rumors were true, that a white hotel owner had voluntarily desegregated his establishment without legal pressure or economic incentive. That night, Billie Holiday performed at the Birmingham Jazz Club to a packed house, and afterward she returned to the Whitmore Hotel where Thomas had prepared his finest room for her. Before she retired for the evening, she spent an hour in the hotel restaurant talking with Thomas, sharing stories about her mother's quiet acts of kindness and the philosophy that had guided her own life, that love and human dignity were more powerful than any law or custom designed to separate people. Thomas listened like a man hearing music for the first time, occasionally wiping tears from his eyes as decades of inherited beliefs crumbled in the face of simple human connection. What Thomas didn't know that night was that his transformation would trigger a cascade of changes throughout Birmingham and beyond. Within a week, 3 other hotel owners in the city quietly removed their segregation signs, inspired by Thomas's example, and emboldened by the surprising lack of serious economic consequences. Within a month, the Birmingham Negro Business Alliance formally recognized Thomas as an ally, a designation that led to increased business from Negro travelers who had previously avoided the city entirely due to lack of accommodations. Within a year, the Whitmore Hotel had become a landmark of integration in the South, mentioned in Negro travel guides as a safe and welcoming establishment. But the true depth of Thomas Whitmore's transformation wouldn't become apparent until years later, when researchers investigating the early civil rights movement discovered his private journals. In entries written in the months following his encounter with Billie Holiday, Thomas documented a profound spiritual and psychological journey. He wrote about the shame he felt when he truly examined the beliefs he'd inherited, about the fear that had kept him enforcing rules he'd never questioned, and about the liberation he experienced when he finally chose compassion over conformity. Most remarkably, he wrote about how that single moment of connection with Holiday had awakened something in him that had been dormant his entire life, an ability to see the humanity in everyone, regardless of surface differences. Thomas's journals also revealed something that Holiday herself never knew. That encounter had saved him from a darkness he'd been spiraling into. In the months before Holiday's arrival, Thomas had been drinking heavily, struggling with depression following his mother's death, and questioning the meaning of his existence. He'd been running his hotel mechanically, following his father's rules because he had no other compass to guide him. When Holiday showed him that photograph of her mother and spoke about human dignity, something clicked into place for Thomas, a sense of purpose he'd been missing. By choosing compassion, by literally tearing down the barriers he'd maintained, Thomas had found a reason to live that went beyond merely existing. Modern psychology has studied cases like Thomas Whitmore's transformation, identifying what researchers call moral crystallization moments. Instances where a person's entire ethical framework realigns based on a single profound experience. Dr. Robert Kellner, a social psychologist at Columbia University, who has studied the Whitmore case extensively, explains that these transformations are possible because human beings are fundamentally capable of empathy, but often suppress that capability due to social conditioning and fear. When someone like Billie Holiday creates a moment of genuine human connection, by sharing vulnerability, by appealing to universal experiences like the love between parent and child, by demonstrating dignity in the face of injustice, it can break through years of conditioning in an instant. What Holiday instinctively understood, and what researchers have since confirmed through studies, is that shame and anger rarely change deeply held beliefs. What changes beliefs is connection, the recognition that the other is fundamentally the same as oneself in ways that matter most. By showing Thomas the photograph of her mother, and speaking about universal human experiences, exhaustion, the need for dignity, the desire to make one's parent proud, Holiday created what psychologists call a bridging moment that allowed Thomas to see past the categories he'd been taught to see her as just another human being trying to live with dignity. In 1954, when the Supreme Court handed down its Brown v. Board of Education decision, Thomas Whitmore was one of the first white business owners in Birmingham to publicly support integration, despite threats and economic pressure from segregationists. By 1960, when the civil rights movement intensified in the South, the Whitmore Hotel had become an unofficial safehouse for activists, a place where integrated groups could meet without harassment. Thomas himself had become a quiet but steadfast supporter of civil rights, using his position as a white business owner to advocate for change within circles that would never have listened to Negro activists. Holiday never sought credit for Thomas's transformation, and in fact she rarely spoke about the incident publicly. When asked by reporters about her experiences with segregation in the South, she would acknowledge the challenges but always emphasized the moments of connection and change rather than the discrimination itself. "I've seen people's hearts change," she once said in an interview in 1956. "I've seen men who were raised to hate learn to love. That gives me more hope than any law could, because laws can change behavior, but only love can change hearts." The photograph that Billie Holiday showed Thomas Whitmore that day in 1949, the picture of her mother in her nurse's uniform, had its own remarkable story. Holiday carried that photograph with her everywhere, a reminder of her mother's teachings about human dignity and compassion. After Holiday's death in 1959, the photograph was found among her possessions, along with a letter she'd written but never sent to Thomas Whitmore, thanking him for his courage and telling him that his transformation had renewed her faith in humanity during a difficult time in her life. Thomas received a copy of that letter in 1962, 3 years after Holiday's death, when a researcher compiling Holiday's biography tracked him down in Birmingham. Upon reading Holiday's words, Thomas broke down completely, overwhelmed by the realization that he had meant as much to her as she had to him. He had the letter framed and hung in the Whitmore Hotel lobby, along with a photograph of Holiday and a placard explaining what had happened that spring day in 1949. The display became a pilgrimage site for civil rights activists and Holiday fans, a tangible reminder that individual acts of courage and compassion could ripple outward in ways no one could predict. In 1987, 38 years after the incident, a documentary filmmaker tracked down several people who had witnessed Thomas Whitmore's transformation. Martha Jenkins, who had been working as a waitress in the Whitmore Hotel restaurant that day, recalled, "I saw Mr. Whitmore's face when Miss Holiday showed him that photograph, and I saw something break open in him. It was like watching a man wake up from a long sleep. He'd been running on automatic, doing what he was told to do, believing what he was told to believe. But in that moment, he became his own person, made his own choice. It was the bravest thing I'd ever seen." James Morrison, a Negro businessman who had been driving past the hotel and stopped to watch the confrontation, remembered we'd all learned to expect rejection, to armor ourselves against the daily humiliations. But Miss Holiday didn't armor herself. She stayed vulnerable, stayed human, and somehow that vulnerability was more powerful than any anger could have been. When I saw that white hotel owner climb up and tear down his own sign, with tears running down his face, I realized I was witnessing something I'd thought was impossible, a genuine change of heart. Today, the story of Billie Holiday and Thomas Whitmore is studied in conflict resolution courses, psychology programs, and civil rights history classes as an example of transformative encounter, a moment when the simple act of recognizing shared humanity can break through seemingly impenetrable barriers. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who teaches civil rights history at Harvard, uses the Whitmore case to illustrate an important principle. The civil rights movement succeeded not just because of laws and protests, though those were crucial, but also because of thousands of individual moments like this one, where people on opposite sides of an unjust system connected as human beings and chose compassion over conformity. The Whitmore Hotel no longer exists. It was demolished in 1973 to make way for a modern office building, but a historical marker stands on the site, commemorating what happened there. The marker's inscription is simple. On this site in 1949, hotel owner Thomas Whitmore made a choice that changed his life and contributed to the broader civil rights movement. Inspired by an encounter with singer Billie Holiday, he voluntarily desegregated his establishment, becoming one of the first white business owners in Birmingham to do so. His courage reminds us that change begins with individual choices to see the humanity in all people. What makes the Holiday-Whitmore encounter particularly significant in the broader context of civil rights history is that it demonstrates the power of what researchers call strategic vulnerability, the conscious choice to remain open and human in situations where anger would be justified. Holiday could have responded to Whitmore's finger-pointing with rage or contempt. She could have invoked her fame, threatened legal action, or simply walked away. Instead, she chose to share something deeply personal, a photograph of her mother, a story about human dignity, and in doing so she created space for transformation. This approach, which Holiday employed throughout her life, was part of a larger philosophy among many civil rights activists who understood that lasting change required not just legal victories, but actual shifts in human consciousness. While some activists took more confrontational approaches, and those approaches were necessary and effective in their own ways, others like Holiday believed that appealing to people's better nature, creating moments of recognition and connection, could produce transformations that would last beyond any particular law or court decision. What's often overlooked in discussions of Holiday's encounter with Thomas Whitmore is the personal cost of her approach. Maintaining composure and grace in the face of discrimination required extraordinary emotional strength and often came at significant psychological expense. Holiday's biographers have documented the toll that constant discrimination took on her mental health, contributing to the depression and substance abuse issues that plagued her later life. The fact that she could still reach out with compassion to someone like Thomas Whitmore, even while carrying her own pain, speaks to a depth of character that goes beyond simple heroism into something approaching sainthood. In this context, Thomas Whitmore's transformation takes on additional significance. By genuinely changing, by becoming an active ally rather than just a passive non-discriminator, Whitmore validated Holiday's faith in human potential and made her emotional labor worthwhile. His transformation rippled outward, affecting not just his hotel but his entire community, creating spaces of safety and welcome that wouldn't have existed otherwise. In a very real sense, Whitmore's courage to change honored Holiday's courage to remain vulnerable, creating a reciprocal transformation that benefited both individuals and their broader communities. More than 7 decades after that spring day in Birmingham, the story of Billie Holiday and Thomas Whitmore remains powerfully relevant. In an era of deep political and social divisions, when different groups often seem locked in impenetrable opposition, their encounter reminds us that human connection remains possible even across seemingly unbridgeable divides. The specific context has changed. Legal segregation has ended, though its legacies persist in countless ways. But the fundamental dynamic remains. People can change, hearts can open, and individual choices to see beyond categories and recognize shared humanity can ripple outward in unexpected ways. The story also challenges simplistic narratives about prejudice and social change. Thomas Whitmore wasn't a cartoon villain who needed to be defeated. He was a man trapped in inherited beliefs, following rules he'd never questioned, until a moment of genuine human connection showed him another way of being. His transformation didn't erase the harm caused by segregation or absolve him of responsibility for his previous actions. But it did demonstrate that people are capable of growth and change when given the right catalyst and the courage to question what they've always believed.